Dr. Ben Abbott, today's guest, is an assistant professor in the Environmental Science and Sustainability program at BYU. He works with a team of students and postdocs to understand sustainability, including research on the shrinking Great Salt Lake. He'll share insights about his work and his superpower. I'm your host, Devin Thorpe. Welcome to the Superpowers for Good show, where we empower you. Dr. Abbott, Ben, thank you very, very much for being here with me today. It's a thrill to connect.
Thank you so much, Devin. Likewise for me.
Well, the Great Salt Lake is something that I have cared about for a long time. I'm embarrassed to admit that my first memory of the Great Salt Lake involved taking the old train out to the lake. You've only heard about that, right? From old people. Now, I am young enough to say that I did that literally as a 5-year-old. The train was long gone by the time I was a teenager. Most of my friends didn't do it, but I have the recollection. Anyway, I care deeply about the Great Salt Lake, and you have been doing some of the most important work there at BYU in terms of research and driving some of the thought around what needs to happen. And there's a lot going on. Prayers for rain and snow that have been answered. I mean, I think this is the wettest winter maybe on record in Utah. Tell us about the situation. I should stop talking and setting the stage. Why don't you set the stage, because you're the expert? But let's have a conversation about the lake.
Yeah, the Great Salt Lake is what we call a keystone ecosystem. So a lot of things depend on that lake being there. And that's really different than what many people think about the lake, because it's salty water, right? And if you're thinking about, are we able to drink it? Are we able to irrigate land with it? Well, it's not useful for that. But actually, these salt lake systems are incredibly important to human health, human economy, as well as the broader ecosystem. And I think it's actually helpful to just take 30 seconds to look at the global view, because there are about 120 of these salt lake systems throughout the world. Great Salt Lake is the largest in North America. And globally, they are all in decline, except for the few in Antarctica, where there's not a direct human footprint in their watershed. And so we've lost about 60% of global saline lake area. And this has caused some of the largest ecological catastrophes that we have faced so far: the destruction of the Aral Sea and Lake Ermia in the Middle East, the disappearance of Owens Lake in California. I like to start with that view. We're thinking about Great Salt Lake because we live here or we've read about it in the national media, but this is actually a global issue. Great Salt Lake naturally fluctuates. It goes up and down because there's no outlet to the ocean. But what we've seen over the last 100 years is a very steep decline, a decrease in the water level. And this is driven overwhelmingly by one thing: extractive human water use. So we divert water primarily from the rivers that are flowing to Great Salt Lake, and then we use that water mainly for agriculture, but also for outdoor vegetation like lawns and trees in urban areas. And then we do extract some water directly from Great Salt Lake to take out minerals that are used for everything from manufacturing our laptops and cars to fertilizing the fruit trees that we depend on. So I was asked the other day, hey, why didn't you tell us about Great Salt Lake earlier? You're just telling us now, we're using too much water. But of course, there have been hundreds of reports and researchers and managers and concerned citizens talking about this for at least 50 years and likely much longer. So we're in this situation. We're using more water than we have sustainably available. And that is causing the decline of this really important ecosystem, the Great Salt Lake.
As you do this work, what are the key drivers? It seems to me it's easy to blame climate change for everything. I am prone to doing that, right? And there are a lot of us in that climate community that want to blame COVID on climate. All kinds of connections, some
Yeah.
of which are more tenuous. Is climate change a factor? And if so, how big a factor? You talk about usage. We ought to talk about, drill down on that a little bit more
Yeah.
too. But let's start with the climate change question.
Yeah, there was a really interesting dialogue in the scientific community a few years ago about this phenomenon called climatization, where everything that goes wrong is because of climate change. Now, we should start out by acknowledging, as you said, in the Earth system, everything is connected. It's one of our only ecological laws. And so certainly when you change something as fundamental as climate, when you disrupt and destabilize the climate, that's going to have impacts on everything. But there's a researcher named Michael Wine who's done kind of the pioneering work on the effects of local water use and climate change on Great Salt Lake and other terminal lake basins. And he estimates in this case that climate change is probably only playing a 5 to 15% role in causing the decline of Great Salt Lake. Now, you turn the temperature up, there's more evaporation from the lake, and then it also takes more water to provide the same services in the watershed to grow crops. But in this case, we're talking about local overuse of water. That's accounting for 80, 90% of the decline of the lake. And that's really, really important, because if it were climate change, then we would have a lot less ability to address this locally. Whereas because we know that it's overconsumption of water, that's something that all of those about 3 million people that live in the Great Salt Lake watershed, we can get together, we can figure out how to, it's just like a bank account, right? Bring our withdrawals down below the deposits and get ourselves back in the black in regards to water.
Yeah. As we look at water use in the Great Salt Lake watershed, agriculture, as you mentioned, is the biggest use of water, but we tend to accept that that's a necessary thing because we all like to eat. Industrial is next, and then the smallest is the water that's used in municipalities. But where do you see the biggest opportunities for us to address the problem?
Yeah, the breakdown is approximately 80-10-10. So 80% agriculture, 10% mineral extraction from the lake, 10% municipal water use, so the urban areas. And we estimate, when we look at the historical record, what's gone on with the lake, that we need about 1 million acre feet more water per year that's going to Great Salt Lake. And that, for most people, myself included, just a few years ago, doesn't mean anything, right? It's an old school unit, a foot of water over an acre of land. But to put that in context, this is going to require about a 30 to 50% decrease in our water use in the watershed. So we're talking about big numbers,
Big difference, yeah,
big differences. And so one very understandable human strategy is to say those cuts need to happen in a different category than what I'm involved in. And most of us live in urban areas and we're not growing crops ourselves. But many of us do have lawns, right? So that's a big thing. And in fact, on the urban water use side, that's what we need to be focused on, right? Reducing the area of our lawns, our outdoor water use. But we can't solve the problem just with that. So we need real changes across all three of those water uses. For example, on the industrial side, there are interesting new techniques to extract some of the high value minerals without evaporating the water. So you can get the lithium and maybe even the magnesium out of the water that are so important for the renewable energy transition without returning that water to the atmosphere. But the big question is, are we going to be able to reduce agricultural water use within that range, 30 to 50%? And there is water to be had by increasing our efficiency. We call that agricultural optimization. Can we get more crop per drop of water that we're growing? And I initially was really hopeful that that was going to get us where we needed to be. Just over the past few weeks, there have been some initial studies about how much we could expect to gain, and they were actually pretty sobering. This is research out of Utah State University, Matt Yost and others, suggesting that we're probably only talking about 10 to 20% increases in agricultural efficiency by upgrading from flood irrigation to sprinkler irrigation, by using precision agricultural techniques where we only put the water and fertilizers where we need them. So ag optimization, really important, but it takes a long time, right? You've got to buy all of that equipment, and it's going to take place over several decades. We also need to be thinking about short term. We probably need decreases in acreage or some targeted fallowing. So alfalfa is the predominant crop that is using water in the watershed. It's also a very flexible crop, so it has some advantages. You can not irrigate it for the second half of the season and get 2 cuttings instead of 3 or 4. That can still be profitable to the farmer. And if we compensate the farmer, right, so pay the difference in how much less alfalfa they got, then they can still be solvent and move forward. And so there are real options. But the fear that I have, just being really frank, is that we haven't come to grips with how serious an issue this is and with how hard the solution is going to be. And so I remember when I first started working as a teenager, kind of magical thinking, hey, I'm going to be able to buy all those CDs. I'm going to date myself here too. I'm not as old as you, Devin, but almost. I'm still going to be able to buy these CDs, even though they cost more than I'm making, right? Somehow it's going to work out. So we've got to be really clear-eyed here and ask ourselves, not only are we making a good effort, are we spending money on this, are we changing the law, but are we doing it fast enough and in profound enough way that we're actually getting water back to the lake? Because the lake responds to how much water flows into it. It doesn't respond to the number of bills that were passed, the number of podcasts that were done on the lake, or even the amount of money that we spend on it. We've got to really be thinking, keep our eye on the ball and say, you know what, our societal well-being, the health of our own bodies and our families and friends, 10 million migratory birds that move through here, 350 species approximately, they all depend on us solving this problem. And nobody has cracked the code yet. If we look globally, there are a few lakes that are sometimes held up, like Mono Lake in California. And that's a great story of people coming together and lawsuits to protect the lake. And even that, all that we did was we slowed the decline, maybe stabilized the lake at a much lower level than where it would be healthy. And so we're really pioneering new ground here. And that's why we can't get distracted. This amazing snow year, it's the biggest snow year on record. It's a real gift. It gives us more, maybe a few months more or a year more time to implement these solutions. It doesn't solve the long-term deficit. This is like a windfall profit that comes around once. And this is also where climate change comes back in, because we're seeing these big snow years less frequently than we used to. And so this may be the last good snow year that we have, and for the next 10 years or 15 years. And so we could really easily be back where we were last year, just in a number of months, if we don't dramatically reduce our water consumption.
Yeah. It seems like one of the real painful realities is that the idea of raising water dependent crops to feed animals in Utah might be problematic fundamentally.
Yeah.
Is that a possibility? Is that really the reckoning that has to happen? If you look at 80-10-10, it sounds to me like you can't solve the problem cutting the 10 and the 10. It's got to be in the 80, and the
Yeah.
big user is alfalfa, some of which we're shipping to faraway places. It's
Yeah.
not even being used to feed animals that feed Utahns.
Yeah.
How I realize that is a fraught conversation. That is difficult, especially when the
Yeah.
governor is an alfalfa farmer. But
Yeah.
how do you, as you look at this as an expert, what do you think?
Well, when you're in a tough situation, you got to have tough conversations. And the same way that if you're talking with a teenager that is running their bank account dry, you got to say, okay, well, what are you spending it on? What could you cut back on? And I think that you're spot on. It's about this animal agriculture question. It's really interesting to me, right? There have been people living in this watershed for probably 20,000 years. And that means that people have been here longer than Great Salt Lake itself, right? They were here before Lake Bonneville drained and then dried, and they have been living really in harmony with the watershed until about the last 100 years. And so that includes both the indigenous peoples, the Shoshone and Ute, Paiute, Goshute, Timpanogos that were here and still are here. But it also is the early European settlers that arrived with the trappers and then later on the Mormon pioneers. And they were using the water to grow local crops for local consumption. And that they were within the realm of what the ecosystem could support. It was only in the mid-1900s when we had these big federally subsidized dam projects and canal and pipeline projects that we started to overuse. And we created this artificial surplus of water, right, that nobody locally was paying for. And that encouraged overconsumption and people thinking about, okay, well, we've got the water, we've got rights to it, so I might as well grow this crop, even if it's only marginally economic, and even if we don't need it here in the region. So I think there's a real lesson that we should be thinking about. There is enough to support our local activity if we're using the gifts of the earth for that purpose. If, on the other hand, we're shipping hay and alfalfa out of the state, even out of the country, then we're going to have to change that. And the risk there, even there are many people that don't want to say that, and I understand, and I don't judge them for that, because the risk of being so clear about, okay, there are going to be people that feel like they're losing as we make this change. The risk is that you alienate some of that community, right, and make people feel really defensive and entrenched in the current way that they're using water. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that we actually, as a community, as a diverse community, right, we got all these different people from all these different backgrounds. I think that we can pull together and really trace a path forward for how to do this. And there are going to be hard conversations. There are going to be people that disagree. That's really important in a crisis situation, right? The last thing that you want is everybody kind of towing the party line and saying the same thing. So, but we all need to kind of do what we can, have conversations where we can. And then I think we need to have both compassion and a lot of support for the legislature and for the executive branches of government, right? Where we're developing relationships, we're encouraging them to implement these long-term water conservation measures, and also saying, hey, what are we going to do to bring our water use down into a sustainable level? What can we do to support you in that? Because agriculture has, they've been here a really long time, and they're a really important part of our community. And so they've got a lot of connections and power. We shouldn't resent that or say, I can't believe that they're influential in that way, but we've got to figure out a way to work with them. And I think that there are pathways forward.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask, because you are one of the few people in the world who probably have some pretty good answers to these questions about consumer water use. So let's just assume that we're talking about a home in Salt Lake City, typical residential home in Salt Lake City. Let's ask the question: if someone in Salt Lake City runs a gallon of water down the toilet, how much of that water ends up in the Great Salt Lake after it's cleaned and processed?
Yeah, it's a really high percentage. Around 95% of that water makes it to Great Salt Lake. And so it still is important to wisely use our indoor water resources. That this doesn't mean that we should all go turn our tubs on and just let it run all of the time. But the consumptive water use is happening outside when you turn your sprinklers on, when you water plants outside. Now, this doesn't mean that we just should have asphalt and cement everywhere. Right, there are plenty of local plants that are incredibly beautiful and diverse that grow here just fine without irrigation. And there's a great website, localscapes.com, that the state has supported, saying how can we have beautiful and enjoyable outdoor landscapes using the plants that are adapted to this climate. There's also slowtheflow.org, which is the state's program. They actually have incentives to help you transition from kind of a Western European outdoor landscaping that has been the dominant form here to more sustainable, lower consumption outdoor landscape. Now, this year in particular, there's some real opportunities because for those of us who've been shoveling the driveway and sidewalks, there's a lot of water in the soil right now, and that actually is going to last for several months into the summer. And so don't turn on your sprinklers. Even if you haven't changed your outdoor landscaping, you probably are overwatering by about a factor of 2. So you might be able to reduce your water consumption, your outdoor water use by 50% simply by only giving your plants what they need. So to reduce that schedule, again, slowtheflow.org has a lot of resources that are going to help you understand what you can do. So we could very easily, on the urban side, if we're aiming for around a 50% decrease, we can hit this with very little pain and suffering. And that's super important because it sends a signal to our agricultural community that we're in this, we're serious. We're not just pointing the finger, but we're making changes. That gives us credibility. That builds solidarity and trust that we desperately need right now.
Yeah. Well, this is really a great conversation. I'm extremely grateful. Let me ask you to step back for just a minute and put your work around Great Salt Lake into the context of your broader work at BYU. Tell us about your lab and the work you're doing there more broadly, so that everyone has an opportunity to really understand who you are.
Yeah, I feel so grateful for the amazing team here at BYU. We are a group of postdoctoral researchers, graduate students, and undergraduate students. There are about 30 members of our lab that are working together on our field is called ecosystem ecology. And so it has to be the most redundant sounding field in all of science, right? How many times can you get eco in there? But we're trying to understand how the whole ecosystem works: the water, the carbon, the nitrogen, the people, right? We're living in an epoch called the Anthropocene, where people are the defining force in the Earth system. And so more and more, our lab has started focusing on these human issues. So we do a lot of work on air and water pollution, on climate change solutions, on ecosystem feedbacks, and also on local habitat and conservation. So we've worked over the past few years extensively on Utah Lake, which was threatened by a development proposal to build artificial islands, and then more recently on Great Salt Lake, and thinking about sustainability throughout the whole watershed. So it's really a privilege. I just love coming in to work and talking with these creative young people and people of all ages from all backgrounds. There's so many good people in the world generally, and I feel privileged to work here with this group.
Yeah, but it is incredibly important and couldn't be more timely. It turns out in 2023. So I commend you for the great work you're doing. And it seems to me, as I've read some of about your work, that you have at least a personal, if not collective, focus on impact. How do you measure your results?
Yeah, that's we need impact, right? We, like we were talking about, we don't need another scientific paper, as important as that is, right? That's how we understand things, but that's not the right metric to evaluate, are we being successful? We try to think, we've tried to guide ourselves looking at what are the most important problems, what are the most pressing issues that we're facing as a people. And that's been a messy process. There's not a list. You can't ask ChatGPT, what's the most important thing that I should be working on, right? It's not going to give you the right answer. And so a lot of what we do is actually reading and listening to learn from others, to understand how are these problems connected. So for example, if you look at the number one environmental issue that I am worried about is the degradation of human health from pollution. There are 15 million premature deaths every year because of the pollution that we're creating and putting into the Earth system. And to put that in context, that's more deaths than all of the violence, all of the communicable diseases, all of the malnutrition globally combined. I mean, it's enormous. And that's being driven predominantly by our dependence on fossil fuels, our overconsumption of fossil fuels. And so as that might sound really basic and simple to many of you, but actually assembling the data to compare those different risk factors for death, and then understanding what are the viable solutions to reduce our addiction to fossil fuels, that took years of research for us to understand and begin to start engaging usefully on that. And so there's this real balance between, we're all feeling some amount of eco-anxiety and fear for the future. So that can make us want to go really fast and not be, never compromise on any of these issues. But at the same time, we've got to have that intellectual humility to realize, wow, I just read a newspaper article on this. I'm not an expert. I've got to dig deeper before I start criticizing other people about this. Now, I think if there's a single superpower that our group has, it's collaboration. Because when we can think about, this isn't about gaining a relative advantage over a competitor. It's not about increasing the number of scientific publications. It's about moving us toward a solution to these issues. Then we're all on the same side, right? When somebody else has a big breakthrough in renewable energy or in agricultural optimization, you celebrate that, right? It's like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. This is moving us where we need to go. So that idea of focusing on the problem and then trying to engage with humility and open mind and open heart. That's what we're trying to do, though we certainly don't always succeed.
Yeah, it reminds me of an old aphorism that the real substance of humility is being teachable. And so you've drawn that connection there without using that phrase, but very, very powerful. You alluded to the fact that your group superpower is collaboration, which is
Mhm.
my favorite superpower, perhaps. But what is your superpower?
Hmm. You know, we've we've had some really hard times over the past few years. Uh, I We engaged on the COVID-19 public health crisis, the pandemic, and it was really discouraging to see the scientific community was trying to get as good information as we could out there. It was largely not understood and not implemented by some officials, by some legislators, and even the governor's office, and that was really discouraging, right? But then I realized, and we talked about this at length. Hey, it isn't about us, and it's not whether our report was taken seriously or if we got credit for the change that was made. It's again focusing on solving the problem. And so I think that it's been a real gift, and I don't know exactly where this comes from, but being able to realize that it's not about me personally, and whether we succeed or fail, that's bigger than any one of us. What we're called to do is to help as we can, and move forward. And when you take yourself, when you try to decenter the ego, it becomes a lot easier to take setbacks and criticisms or personal attacks, because you're like, oh, those things are just affecting my personal reputation, or things like that. Likewise with Utah Lake, I got personally sued for $3 million for the education and research work that we were doing. And that was really destabilizing, to have my
Yes, so.
livelihood threatened. But again, I felt really supported, thinking about, hey, this is really about the lake. And this is, of course, disruptive to me and my family for a short period of time, but it may be a step toward permanent protection and better management of the lake. And I believe ultimately it was. So reducing the ego and thinking about what does the community need, I've actually found to be incredibly nourishing and motivating. So that, yeah, that was a long way of answering, Devin.
Yeah. But I think what you're saying is, and I sometimes hate this label because no one would ever say this, but in a way you're saying humility is your superpower, because you're able to put the needs of others ahead of your own needs, put outcomes ahead of credit, et cetera, et cetera. Like the old saying attributed to just about every president who's dead, that doesn't matter who gets, if you don't, you can get a lot more done if you don't care who gets the credit, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
That's a great way to say it. I'm basically the most humble person you've ever met. Yeah. well, that might be. Here's another thing, Devin. I think it is so important to enjoy and to laugh and connect, and that's a part of this collaboration idea. It's, if you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders and it's just grinding you down, guess what? That's not helping the world, and that's not helping you personally, right? Because you're not going to be in a place that you can have the energy and desire and passion to engage. And so being open to unexpected relationships and conversations, being able to see the beauty in everything around us. There is so much beauty. There's so many reasons to be hopeful about the future and to really work for it. Hope comes from action, I believe. When I sit at home and look at these numbers for the 2,000 to 8,000 premature deaths due to air pollution just here in Utah, that's 10 times as many people as die in all car accidents. That can be crushing. When instead we're thinking about, hey, who can I talk with? Hey, there's this clean air caucus in the legislature that's working on this issue. They really care about this issue. Bipartisan. that's where the hope comes in. You start to believe that we can make a difference, and it does. I've seen time and time again an undergraduate student with very little experience identify what needs to be done, and then figure out a creative way to move things forward. Now, none of them, myself included, have ever completely solved one of these issues, but we're pushing. I actually love, for my religion, we have this metaphor of put your shoulder to the wheel. And there's this big wagon that we're trying to move forward. We can't do it on our own, but let's all put our shoulder to the wheel and try to move it forward. And it's fun. And you sing and you laugh, and so that's and you're, of course, a great example of this as well.
Yeah, well, but let's let me ask one final question about this idea of your superpower and humility, and you're willing to put the outcomes and the impacts ahead of your own need for credit. What would you coach, say, your students? You coach them all the time. How do you coach them to emulate you in this way? And I know you would never describe it as emulating yourself. You're too humble for that. But if you're coaching them to do this, how do you coach them to do it?
Thank you for that question. When I talk with students at any stage, right? Because we have students who are 70 years old here at the university. It's really cool to see all this diversity of background. But if you're coming from a place of fear, where you're really worried that it's going to be hard to find a place to put your shoulder to the wheel, that it's going to be hard to carve out a little spot for you to benefit, then you usually end up in a suboptimal profession or area. Now, every profession is needed, right? And so it's not that the profession itself is suboptimal, but the match between the person and their interests and gifts and what they're doing is a match. Now, a lot of that fear comes from this focus, or this unhelpful belief that you've got to specialize early. You've got to decide what you're going to do and stick with it your whole life so you can get ahead of other people. There was that book about outliers. You got to spend 10,000 hours working on this thing. Well, I really like the idea of late specialization, of taking the time to understand yourself, to understand the system, and figure out where you can contribute. That takes time, but it takes faith as well. You've got to be able to suspend that fear, that voice of doubt that's telling you that there's not going to be an opportunity for you. If you say no to this thing over here, this bird in hand, then you're never going to get any of those birds in the bush, right? So having that faith moving forward, identifying the problems that matter, and then figuring out a way, big or small, that you can contribute to them, that leads to the biggest impact, I believe.
Yeah. Well, I am grateful for your powerful insights. As we wrap up now, I wonder if you would take just a minute and tell people how they can learn more about your work. And if you've, to the extent I know you've published stuff on the Great Salt Lake, and because that was the focus of our attention, perhaps you can tell people how to track those papers down. Maybe you can take a minute to tell people how to connect with you on social media. If you're open to a more direct contact, tell them how to do that in a way that's conducive to your work, and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. That, as you were asking that question, Devin, it just triggered another thought in my mind. Again, and it's about this fear and scarcity versus thinking about problems. There's some labs here on campus and elsewhere that say, hey, you've got to apply and you got to meet these certain standards to participate. We run our lab differently. We have a completely open lab, not only for BYU students, but for anyone in the community that is interested in getting involved, because these problems are big and we need you. I mean, we need everyone, because you're going to be able to reach people that aren't going to listen to me because of my background and the way that I talk and other things. So if people are interested, our website is Ben Abbott, BENABBOTT.BYU.edu. That's our lab's website. It's got a join tab where you can get involved. We've got just a kind of an email list where we send out information and a weekly lab meeting specific to Great Salt Lake issues. We wrote this report that's at GSL for Great Salt Lake, gsl.byu.edu. And we tried to keep that focused on how are we going to get water to the lake, but we also tried to link to the many reports that have been done before. Now, if you see things that are confusing or distracting in that report, we're always open to that feedback as well. So reach out. And I'm on Twitter at thermokarst. It's a permafrost term from another area of our research, but just search Ben Abbott and it should come up. But
and we'll put some links in the show notes too. We'll write this up and put this in the show notes so people can track you down. But Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a thrill to connect. The protecting the Great Salt Lake is, as you point out, a model for solving so many environmental problems. Yeah. It is acute, it is urgent, it requires immediate action. And if you can find the model for doing that in Utah to save the Great Salt Lake, it's a model in a broader sense for solving climate change for the planet. So we wish you every single possible victory and success in the great work that you're doing.
Thank you so much, Devin. And thank you, everyone who's listening to this. Please do reach out with your feedback, and let's all put our shoulder to the wheel.
All righty. Let's do some good.
Thank you for tuning in to the Superpowers for Good show. Twice each week, we host changemakers who share their impact, insights, and superpowers. Don't miss another episode. Subscribe today at superpowersforgood.com. That's superpowers, good.com. Be super empowered. Get your copy of the book, Superpowers for Good, as an ebook, audiobook, paperback, or hardcover edition via your favorite online retailer. Interested in having me speak to your company, organization, or association? Visit devinthorpe.com. Then let's talk. Now, keep using your superpowers for good. Together, we can reverse climate change, improve global health, and eradicate poverty.